Earth had always been overlooked by the greater galactic civilizations. A backwater planet, primitive by galactic standards, barely scraping the edges of interstellar travel. The Galactic Council dismissed humanity as just another minor species, too insignificant to be of concern. That changed the day the Xelari Empire made a mistake that would alter the balance of power forever. The Xelari, an ancient and warlike species, thrived on conquest. Their fleets had crushed countless civilizations, and their empire stretched across hundreds of star systems. When they discovered Earth, they barely paid attention. It was simply another planet to add to their dominion. Humanity was given an ultimatum: surrender and become slaves or be annihilated. The message arrived in a grand display of power. A Xelari dreadnought, over 10 kilometers long, hovered above Earth's atmosphere, blotting out the sky in several cities. Their demands echoed across human communication channels. The Council of Nations gathered in a frantic emergency meeting. Politicians argued, generals debated, scientists scrambled for solutions. The Xelari believed they had already won. They expected immediate surrender. Instead, they were met with something they had never encountered before. Humanity refused. The Xelari were amused at first, then enraged. A fleet of 100 warships was dispatched to make an example of Earth. The skies above the planet burned as kinetic bombardment struck military installations. Cities trembled under the threat of orbital dominance. But Earth was not like the other worlds the Xelari had conquered. Humanity had spent centuries perfecting the art of war, and while their technology was inferior, their minds were something the Xelari had not accounted for. The first mistake the Xelari made was underestimating human resilience. Bombardment struck military bases, but underground bunkers shielded Earth's forces. Soldiers adapted instantly, using guerrilla warfare tactics refined over centuries. Xelari ground troops found themselves in a nightmare of urban warfare, ambushes, and sabotage. For every city they attacked, human forces countered with devastating ingenuity. Explosives turned ruined streets into death traps, snipers took down commanders, and entire supply chains were severed overnight. The second mistake the Xelari made was assuming their technology alone would win the war. They had superior ships, energy weapons, and planetary assault mechs, but human scientists worked tirelessly to close the gap. Within days, humanity had reverse-engineered captured Xelari tech. Engineers repurposed energy shields for mobile defense. Hackers infiltrated enemy communications, turning their own strategies against them. The Xelari were unprepared for how quickly humans learned and adapted. The third mistake was assuming that fear alone would break humanity's spirit. Instead, it forged them into something else. The moment the Xelari began slaughtering civilians, humanity stopped fighting for survival and started fighting for vengeance. The world united in a way it never had before. Old rivalries meant nothing when the alternative was extinction. Nations pooled their resources, industries shifted to wartime production, and for the first time, humanity had a single, undeniable purpose. Then came the moment that changed everything. A human fleet, cobbled together from salvaged Xelari wreckage and retrofitted warships, launched a counterattack. It was meant to be a desperate strike against the Xelari command ship. It turned into something far greater. Earth's forces, though smaller and technologically outclassed, fought with a ferocity the galaxy had never seen. The Xelari fleet, designed for overwhelming force, found itself outmaneuvered, outthought, and outmatched in sheer willpower. Human pilots turned kamikaze strikes into precise surgical assaults. Ground forces stormed Xelari warships, taking control from the inside. The dreadnought that once loomed over Earth was boarded, captured, and turned against the enemy. In mere months, the impossible had happened. The Xelari fleet was shattered. Their empire, which had stood for millennia, faced something they had never before encountered. A species that refused to bow. A species that refused to break. A species that had just begun to fight. The Xelari Empire reeled from its unexpected defeat at Earth's hands. Their fleet, once considered unstoppable, had been shattered. Their pride had been wounded in a way no species had ever managed before. But more than that, something far more dangerous had happened. Humanity had gained momentum. Captured Xelari warships were studied and dismantled. Human engineers worked tirelessly, reverse engineering alien technology at a speed that baffled even the most advanced galactic civilizations. The first breakthrough came within weeks, a new form of hybrid spacecraft, combining Xelari energy shielding with human adaptability. The second came shortly after, advanced plasma weaponry, improved and miniaturized for use in ground warfare. But the real revolution wasn't technology. It was the shift in mindset. The humans had tasted victory against a superior force, and they weren't going to stop. Across the planet, recruitment centers overflowed with volunteers. Factories churned out war machines at an unprecedented pace. Nations that had once been enemies now stood side by side, bound by a single purpose: to take the fight to the Xelari before they could recover. The Galactic Council watched in stunned silence. Earth, once considered a primitive world, had just done the impossible. The Xelari had spent centuries crushing opposition, expanding their dominion without challenge. Now, a single planet had brought them to the edge of collapse. The Xelari High Command, desperate to reassert dominance, assembled an even larger fleet. 300 warships, the most powerful armada ever gathered, were sent to end humanity once and for all. They never made it to Earth. The moment they entered the Sol system, they were ambushed. Humanity had learned. They knew Xelari tactics, their formations, their weaknesses. The Xelari, expecting an easy victory, found themselves facing something terrifying, a species that adapted faster than any in recorded history. Humanity used every trick in the book. Asteroids were turned into kinetic weapons. Electromagnetic pulses disrupted Xelari targeting systems. AI-assisted targeting systems ensured that every human shot counted. The battle, which the Xelari had expected to last mere hours, stretched into days. And then, in a move that stunned the entire galaxy, humanity did the unthinkable. They took prisoners. No one had ever taken a Xelari prisoner before. They had always fought to the last soldier, preferring death over capture. But the humans weren't just warriors. They were strategists. Captured Xelari were interrogated, their minds studied, their command structures exposed. Within weeks, humanity understood their enemy in a way no species ever had before. The Xelari homeworld, once thought untouchable, was suddenly within reach. The Xelari homeworld, Korathar, had never known fear. For thousands of years, it stood as the beating heart of an empire built on conquest. Its defenses were impenetrable. Its fleets unmatched. The idea that an enemy would dare to threaten it was unthinkable. Until now. Humanity had done the impossible twice, first by surviving, then by defeating the Xelari fleet in open combat. But survival was not enough. The war had become something greater. This was not just about defending Earth. It was about ensuring that no other species suffered under the Xelari ever again. And so, the invasion of Korathar was planned. It was an operation unlike any in human history. Every scientist, every engineer, every strategist worked toward one singular goal: bringing the Xelari Empire to its knees. Their technology had been stolen. Their tactics had been analyzed. Their weaknesses had been exposed. When the first human fleet entered Xelari space, the reaction was immediate. The Xelari, still reeling from their losses, scrambled to assemble a defense. Hundreds of warships formed a blockade around their capital world. They expected a direct assault. They expected brute force. They should have known better. Humanity had never been the strongest, the fastest, or the most advanced. But they had always been the most unpredictable. As the Xelari focused on the incoming fleet, they failed to notice the second wave, dozens of cloaked strike teams infiltrating the planet's surface. Sabotage teams disabled planetary defenses. AI-driven cyber warfare units took control of critical infrastructure. The Xelari defense grid, once thought invincible, collapsed in hours. And then came the real nightmare. The human fleet, no longer hindered by planetary defenses, launched its attack. But it wasn't a conventional assault. They didn't bombard cities. They didn't slaughter civilians. They targeted leadership. In one night, the High Command was eliminated. Government centers were seized. The Xelari leadership, who had spent centuries ruling through fear, suddenly found themselves powerless. By dawn, the impossible had happened. Korathar had fallen. For the first time in history, the Xelari Empire was no longer the galaxy's dominant force. And for the first time, humanity stood as something far more than a survivor. They were conquerors. The fall of Korathar sent shockwaves through the galaxy. The Xelari Empire, which had stood unchallenged for millennia, was shattered in a matter of months. Entire fleets surrendered. Former vassal species rebelled. The empire collapsed faster than anyone had imagined possible. And at the center of it all was humanity. The Galactic Council, which had once dismissed Earth as a primitive backwater, now watched in stunned silence. They had seen civilizations rise and fall, but never had a single species risen so quickly. Never had an empire been dismantled with such precision. But the war was not over. The Xelari were not extinct. Scattered warlords refused to surrender, retreating to distant star systems. They had lost their homeworld, but not their will to fight. And more importantly, the rest of the galaxy had a new fear. What would humanity do next? The question echoed across every major world. Some hoped Earth would take the Xelari's place, ruling through strength. Others feared that humanity would turn its attention to them next. The balance of power had shifted, and no one knew what the future held. Humanity, however, had no desire to rule an empire. They had won not out of conquest, but out of necessity. They had fought not for power, but for survival. Yet they could not ignore the reality they had created. With the Xelari gone, there was a void in the galaxy. Chaos threatened to spread. Warlords, slavers, and remnants of the old empire sought to carve out their own territories. Without order, the cycle of conquest and suffering would begin again. And so, humanity made a decision that stunned the galaxy once more. They did not claim the Xelari throne. They did not impose their rule. Instead, they did something far more dangerous. They rebuilt. Not just for themselves, but for the entire galaxy. Former Xelari slaves were freed. Planets ravaged by war were restored. Advanced technology, once hoarded by the Empire, was shared with those in need. Humanity didn't just defeat the Xelari. They replaced them with something better. A new alliance was formed, one built on cooperation rather than domination. And at its heart stood Earth, not as conquerors, but as the architects of a new galactic order. But in the shadows, enemies watched. The old powers of the galaxy had no intention of allowing humanity to reshape the universe. And far beyond the known systems, something even worse was stirring. Humanity had won a war. But the real battle was just beginning. As humanity worked to stabilize the galaxy, they found themselves facing a new challenge, governing without ruling. The newly freed species looked to Earth for leadership, but humanity refused to become another empire. Instead, they formed the Galactic Coalition, an alliance built on cooperation rather than conquest. Former Xelari worlds were integrated into the coalition, their people given a voice for the first time. Human engineers helped rebuild devastated planets, their technology shared freely. It was an unprecedented move, one that inspired hope across the stars. But not everyone welcomed this new order. Remnants of the Xelari Empire had retreated into the uncharted regions of the galaxy. Scattered warlords, rogue admirals, and fanatics who refused to accept defeat plotted their revenge. They saw humanity not as liberators, but as usurpers. And then came the first attack. A Xelari warlord, known as Korak the Unyielding, emerged from the shadows with a fleet of stolen warships. He struck without warning, targeting a newly established coalition world. The planet burned. Millions died. The message was clear, the war was not over. But Korak had underestimated humanity. The coalition responded immediately, not with hesitation, but with overwhelming force. A fleet of hybrid warships, faster and deadlier than anything seen before, intercepted Korak's forces. The battle lasted mere hours. The Xelari remnants were wiped out. Korak was captured. And for the first time, the galaxy saw the full extent of humanity's power. The coalition was not just a peacekeeping force. It was a shield. A sword. A warning. But even as humanity crushed the remnants of the old empire, something else was happening. Deep in the void, beyond explored space, strange signals began to appear. At first, they were dismissed as background noise. But then they grew stronger. An unknown force was watching. Humanity had defeated the Xelari. Now, something far worse was coming. The signals grew stronger, more distinct. They weren't random noise. They were deliberate. A pattern. A message. But it wasn't in any known language. It was something else, something ancient. Humanity's best minds worked to decipher the transmissions, but no matter how they analyzed them, one thing was clear. The signals weren't just being sent. They were scanning. Probing. Studying. And then, without warning, they stopped. Silence. For weeks, nothing happened. The galaxy held its breath. Some dismissed it as meaningless, the remnants of an extinct civilization. Others feared the truth, something had been watching, and now it had found what it was looking for. Then the first ships arrived. They emerged from deep space, massive constructs of shifting black metal, their forms unlike anything ever recorded. They didn't communicate. They didn't respond to hails. They simply descended upon a distant outer colony and erased it from existence. Not conquered. Not occupied. Erased. The coalition scrambled to respond. Humanity's fleets mobilized, their warships faster and stronger than ever. But when they arrived, there was nothing left. No bodies. No wreckage. Just silence. Then came the second attack. Another world gone. Another void left behind. No survivors. No distress signals. Just absence. And then, the truth was revealed. Buried in ancient Xelari records, long-forgotten warnings were discovered. They spoke of a force that came before the Xelari. Before any known empire. A force that didn't conquer. It consumed. They had many names in different civilizations, but one thing was consistent. They were extinction itself. And now, they had returned. The war with the Xelari had made humanity the strongest power in the galaxy. But none of that mattered anymore. Because for the first time, they weren't fighting for dominance. They weren't fighting for survival. They were fighting to save existence itself. The first real battle against the unknown force took place in the outer rim of coalition space. Humanity's fleet, armed with the best technology they had stolen, reverse-engineered, and improved, faced an enemy unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. The invaders didn't use traditional weapons. Their ships seemed alive, shifting and regenerating mid-battle. They moved in ways that defied physics, bending space around them. Their attacks didn't just destroy, they consumed, reducing matter to nothingness. The first engagement was a massacre. A fleet of 50 human warships engaged a small force of the invaders. Only 3 ships returned. They carried no survivors, just fragmented data, garbled sensor readings, and one horrifying realization. The enemy wasn't just powerful. It was learning. Every shot fired, every tactic used, was analyzed and countered in real time. What worked in one moment became useless in the next. Humanity had fought adaptable enemies before, but this was something else. This was a predator evolving with every kill. The coalition panicked. Some worlds wanted to surrender, to beg for mercy. Others believed running was the only option. But humanity had already made its decision. They would not run. They would not kneel. If this was the end, they would make sure the enemy bled for every star they took. And so, the greatest minds of Earth worked without rest. Scientists, engineers, strategists, all of them racing against time. Humanity had always won by adapting faster than their enemies, and this would be no different. A breakthrough came. Not in weapons, but in understanding. The invaders were not invincible. They were built to consume, to destroy, but they had never faced something like humanity before. They had never encountered a species that didn't just fight for survival, but for vengeance. Armed with new weapons designed to disrupt the enemy's regenerative abilities, humanity launched its counterattack. This time, they weren't reacting. They were dictating the battle. The first victory was small, a single enemy vessel destroyed without it reforming. But it was enough. For the first time, the invaders hesitated. And that hesitation was all humanity needed. With every battle, the coalition grew stronger. New tactics, new weapons, new strategies, each one designed to exploit the enemy's weaknesses. What was once an unstoppable force now found itself facing something it had never encountered before. A species that refused to be consumed. The war raged on, but the tide had turned. The invaders had come expecting to feed on a dying galaxy. Instead, they had awakened something far more dangerous. Humanity had already reshaped the galaxy once. Now, they would do it again. And this time, nothing would stand in their way.